You're watching KOAT Action 7 News.
APD's overtime is skyrocketing, costing you millions, and the Attorney General is now investigating, and the city's independent auditor wants some of the officers to pay the money back.
In a Target 7 investigation, Todd Kurtz looks into how 40 officers were able to get paid more than $50,000 a year in overtime alone.
So this is how much of your tax dollars have gone to pay police officer overtime in the last 12 years. It adds up to $152 million. In this Target 7 investigation, we found that some of these officers are being accused of not actually working the hours they're getting paid for. Dozens of Albuquerque police officers could be in hot water. This document, obtained by Target 7, shows that city auditors found 64 cases in which cops claimed overtime they hadn't worked. And now the city's internal auditor is recommending they all pay it back. But these officers could be in more trouble.
There is a state law, it's in black and white, the legislature passed it, that makes it a fourth-degree felony for any public employee to receive money for work they didn't do.
Auditors took a random sample of shifts to see if officers actually worked what they got paid for. The results of their study found dozens of cases where officers' overtime was at least a half hour more than what they actually worked. The cases they allege overtime was abused totaled more than $4,500. So here's how the audit said officers were doing this. Most of them have a computer inside their car, just like this one. They log in to let dispatchers know they're ready for an emergency. But auditors allege the officers were logging out at least a half hour early and then claiming their time when they would fill out the timesheet like this one. KOAT legal expert John Day has prosecuted and defended what state law calls time card fraud.
Never seen it on a scale this big. Usually it's isolated to one officer who is putting in for overtime that they didn't work and they're getting paid for hours they didn't work. That's the same situation here, just multiplied by 10, by 20, by 30.
The audit was started after an APD spokesman made more than $160,000 in a single year when his base salary was $65,000. He retired after APD requested the AG to conduct the criminal investigation.
If you have so many officers who are violating state law or being paid for hours they didn't work, should APD just turn a blind eye to that and say, well, it happened so many times, we're going to ignore it? Or should they say we're going to conduct a criminal investigation?
We asked that question to APD's interim chief.
Right now, as it stands, we would need time to review every single case, go over every single fact, interview individuals, and we have so many priorities that we're working on right now that's not something that we're currently looking at.
APD overtime has been a growing issue for years. Look at this chart. Since 2008, it has jumped from 8 million to 17 million.
This has not been done in a vacuum. This is what happens when you do not have a fully staffed police department. And the overtime budget will continue to expand unless the city of Albuquerque gets dedicated and focused on really growing staff in here.
APD Union President Sean Willoughby questions how the internal auditor was able to determine that officers were not actually working. He says not every officer clocks in and clocks out on a computer.
There needs to be a lot more investigation that goes into determining whether or not somebody needs to pay something back.
Interim Chief Medina blames former Police Chief Mike Geyer for APD's overtime woes. In this press release, he called it, quote, a mess that was left behind. But Medina was second in charge the entire time Geyer was chief.
We talked about revising and updating an overtime policy. That never got done. And I think it's imperative that a chief makes sure that what needs to get done gets done.
That seems to be a common theme is, blame the outgoing chief.
Geyer says he was already working to change APD's overtime policy months before he claims he was forced to retire by Mayor Keller.
There was a lot of work done in the preliminary stages to try to get those first drafts done. Summer.
Interim Chief Medina says he already changed some policies of his own, and supervisors will now be disciplined if they approve overtime that's not legit.
I don't think this is a process that just is over and done with one policy, but one policy is a start, and correcting behavior is a start. So I think that we've already taken off and we've worked to make some of those changes.
We reached out to the Attorney General's office. They tell us they are now investigating all of APD overtime practices. District Attorney declined to comment. The audit also identified a case in which a civilian employee is accused of using her supervisor's computer login to approve her own overtime. Both those employees are no longer with the department.
For Target 7, I'm Todd Kurtz.
APD is not alone with its overtime issues. Earlier this year, 9 Boston police officers were charged by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts for what they called an overtime fraud scheme.